I'm so excited to have Andrea here. Quick background on Andrea. She was the growth product lead at Amplitude. She was there from Series D through IPO and beyond. And she's been driving PLG on the product side, but close collaboration with sales, marketing, really the whole gamut to really build the incredible motion that Amplitude started. And it's really interesting, especially because Amplitude, from my understanding, started as more of a sales-led company and then went product-led. So I think this is a super interesting thing to dive into because typically we hear the reverse, people starting product-led and going enterprise. Really excited to have you here to talk about everything from going from sales-led to product-led, how to drive product-led monetization, and then balancing both your upmarket enterprise motion with your product-led motion. Oh, and the most important part is Andrea's an angel investor of Pocus and an active investor. So Andrea, would love you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Alexa, for the very kind introduction. I've been at Amplitude for 3 years and 3 months so far, and was the one who came in and had the charter of building out the product growth team on the product side. But early days, I was also wearing a lot of different hats. I was doing a lot of growth marketing work, managing our startup scholarship program to VC incubator partnerships. And at some point was also the one responsible for managing our product-led pipeline on top of our free plan. So a lot of the product-led sales work on top of growth product work as well. Before Amplitude, I was actually in the consumer world. I joined Lime, the scooter company, pre-launch when no one had heard of them. They were doing bike share, was there from Series A to D, where I basically took on all the go-to-market functions plus product management. I was focused on international expansion. I did sales, I did marketing, Series B fundraising strategy, did operations after Series D, fixing unit economics. So I've had a pretty eclectic career so far. And before that, I was in investment banking and management consulting. And here I am. And really excited to chat anything about PLG, which is an area that I've been diving into over the last couple of years.
Something I want to start with is there's lots of growth teams. Like I hear the word growth and marketing and product in a separate org. Like, what does it even mean to be a growth product lead?
So first of all, the concept of a growth team, this team is supposed to drive distribution for a company. How do we connect as many people as possible to the existing value of the product that you already have? So that's the fundamental difference of a growth team versus like a product team. And then when it comes to a growth product team, my team's charter is to really focus on new user activation and free-to-pay monetization at Amplitude. So on the activation side, we use the product levers to really make it super easy for anybody to come in and set up Amplitude, send data in, and get to an aha moment and build the initial habit. Later on, we help them get deeper and deeper engaged and retained with our product to a point where free customers discover the value of our paid features and decide to upgrade to our free plan, either through the self-serve motion or through product-led sales.
What is the difference between growth if it sits on the product team versus the marketing team?
Yeah, so how we kind of divide the charter and responsibility at Amplitude is, so both teams work really closely together to drive the same set of metrics. For example, both teams are accountable to driving activation, retention, and free-to-pay conversion. But where the growth product team focuses a bit more on is using the product levers to drive those, whereas growth marketing focuses a bit more on the acquisition side. How do we get more new signups to Amplitude, and using marketing levers to help drive activation, retention, and monetization. They also explicitly own product-led sales pipeline on top of our free plan, whereas our team focuses a little bit more on free-to-pay conversion.
So where does product-led sales then fit in?
Product-led sales definitely is a super cross-functional responsibility that's touched by so many different functions. So product, sales, growth marketing team all touch it. But officially, the owner of product-led sales and the OKRs associated with it is owned by growth marketing. And the way it works is, for example, we would align on a set of triggers and collaborate on a lot of the analysis and initiatives that really figure out, okay, what drives upgrades, period, whether it's through sales or self-serve. And the growth marketing team is really responsible for the sales handoff, alignment, managing the pipeline, identifying areas of opportunities, and partnering with my team on the growth product side to really ship in-product experiments, or using engineering and data leverage to enable some growth marketing experiments as well to drive that pipeline.
Something that I think is interesting is with product-led growth companies, the growth team, I'm curious, like the difference between you having growth experience at a consumer company versus enterprise, because a lot of product-led growth companies, like I think of especially bootstrap PLG companies like Zapier and Calendly and Webflow, they start with like almost a consumer product and then they grow into an enterprise product. So to me, like, what is the difference of being at a growth lead at a consumer company versus now at a B2B company? Does it feel similarities if there's PLG, or is it totally different?
I think there are a fair number of differences, although in terms of how to think about growth, like the frameworks, the loops, it's pretty much the same, whether you're in consumer or enterprise. So some of the key differences I noticed, number one, the way you drive growth through experimentation, the way you operationalize that is just very different. When you work in a consumer company, you ship an experiment. If you have enough like user base and traffic, you usually know if things are working within a day or two. Whereas after I came to Amplitude, I realized in a B2B company, especially if you're running experiments on the account or org level, you really don't have that much sample size to be able to reach stat sig within a very, very short amount of time. So it's very common for us to ship experiments that might take like a quarter to really understand if things are moving in the right direction. So that leads to, I just think, a different way of generating insights and learnings. So sometimes when we do the pre-experiment analysis, we would decide, okay, maybe it's the right strategy not to run an A/B test because it takes too long, there's too much of an opportunity cost. And if we have high conviction hypotheses based on our user research and understanding of the customers, we'll just ship that change and then see how the metrics would evolve. So sometimes we resort to more of the before-after experiments versus a controlled A/B test. So that's difference number one. Number two is I think there's just so much more interdependency with everything the growth teams do that touch sales and marketing. So there's definitely a ton of alignment, dependency management, and change management involved when we roll out growth experiments. For example, when we introduce trials of features, of a paid feature to our free customers, and we want to kind of bridge that with sales by creating a campaign and having them follow up with people who are really engaged using the trial. There's a ton of enablement required before the launch to make sure that they understand what we're doing and how to have the right talk track with those customers. So definitely the sales alignment piece is super, super crucial in B2B growth, as well as I think just generally working well with these functions to be able to effectively spin up like sales assist motions and on the monetization side, especially. Lastly, I think even though I think user research is important to growth initiatives in both consumer and enterprise contexts, I just feel like in B2B side, it's extra important. Just like how to build B2B product is very different from building consumer product. In like B2B core product development, you often see like PMs spend a lot of time every single week talking to customers. Growth teams in a PLG company in B2B also need to do the same. So really understanding who are the personas, what are their pain points going through the like onboarding, or what are the reasons why they convert or don't convert via monetization, I think is extra important for a PLG as well.
It was interesting to hear your perspective of sales enablement and working with the sales team to make sure that experiments are running properly and you're able to enable everyone that's involved in the experiments that the growth team is running. Jonathan, AKA Jay Hill, this might be a good segue into customer success. Do you want to ask your question, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And so, yeah, generally curious how you think about customer success when it comes to growth. We talk a lot about growth as top of funnel and acquisition, and many people have deployed their success functions in a variety of ways: early stage, late stage, enterprise versus SMB. What's your experience been with that, and where do you kind of think it best fits in with a B2B motion?
I think some learnings with collaborating with customer success here at Amplitude is that usually at a B2B company, CS team is very focused on paying customers. Like they definitely touch every stage of the customer journey, especially post-purchase, starting with implementation, onboarding, to retention, and even upsell. In certain cases, CS actually might be accountable to expansion revenue. I'm not sure if that's the case everywhere. So that definitely heavily overlaps with the growth team's charter, because both growth marketing and growth product side, these teams not only care about acquisition, they also care about using product and marketing levers to drive activation, retention, and expansion as well. So that tight partnership to really collaborate on insights, because CSMs are so close to customers. They are probably the best source of customer insights and pain points in the entire organization, other than sales, who also interfaces with the customers all the time. So we have a really close feedback loop with CS to really understand the top pain points for people to really adopt Amplitude to retain or expand. I think several key learnings in terms of how to make that relationship run really well in a PLG organization is, number one is forget about the dichotomy of CS serving paying customers and growth teams caring about free customers. We actually find that even though the customer base and the ICP looks a little bit different, when we look at the free customer base versus the paying customer base, definitely there is a difference in like budget and the size of the organization. But when it comes to adopting a product like Amplitude, their pain points and use cases are quite similar. So we used to have a model where CS teams would run like automated programs to scalably engage with the paying customers in the activation journey or in the adoption journey. But later we just realized, why can't those things be applied to our free customer base? There's absolutely no reason. So I think we started to break down those barriers and just make it less defined that the CS team only runs programs for paying customers and the growth teams only touches free customers, so that we could really exchange these best practices and view the entire customer base the same way, and make sure that there is no silo in terms of the playbooks that we will run across both. So that's one key learning that I highly recommend to other companies that also have a similar collaboration model between CS and growth teams. And otherwise, I feel like the way I view the three functions is like, in order to drive activation, retention, and monetization, you would have product levers to drive that. You would have marketing levers to drive that, which growth marketing is heavily involved in, and product marketing. And CS implements a more people-oriented strategy to build relationships and have more human touch in the entire customer journey. So I view those three as a trifecta. They are supposed to be highly complementary to each other and definitely not mutually exclusive. So what we usually do, and which I find effective, is every single time when it comes to a broader like activation strategy brainstorm, we would involve stakeholders from all of these functions to really figure out what is the ideal vision and experience we want to create for the end customers, no matter what channel or what lever we want to use. Figure out what best in class experience looks like first, and then figure out what role should product play in achieving that vision? What role should CS come in and layering on human touch to achieve our outcomes? So I think that way it also breaks down some of those sometimes territorial issues that come up when teams want to do certain things that might sound very duplicative with something else that some other team is trying to do, to really align on the shared vision first.
Anyone else have questions on like how growth interacts with other functions before I switch topics a little? Cheyenne, do you want to give your question?
So I am going to be a bit selfish. I was hoping for that was a great answer. Like double clicking on the feedback loop, because my organization is like pretty early in the PLG motion. And if you could expand on tactically, what are some things that you could do? Like, is a meeting? Is it pre-development of a feature? Is it just when they're exploring new features? Do they just want to hear from what you know about customer conversations? What is the feedback loop tactically when it comes to some processes with the different teams?
Yeah, these processes definitely are dependent on the culture of your company. But the way it works for us, there's so many different ways we structure that feedback loop. One is definitely recurring meetings with certain POCs on the CS side who tend to have like aggregate insights over account health activity across accounts in the market segment. For example, the growth team works really closely with the corporate CS team here, who works a lot with SMB customers who are on the play plans or have upgraded from our free plan historically, to really understand who are those customers like, what do they need. And the second way we partner is when a product team wants to ship a feature, we usually go to a set of CSMs across different market segments to gauge do you know any accounts who have expressed insight, like questions about this part of our capability? Do you know anybody who might be interested in this? And of course, we leverage a lot of tools previously that also centralize this type of feedback from the CS team and from the end customers. As PMs, we can also go in and search for those insights ourselves. Number 3 is when it comes to strategy brainstorm and roadmap planning, we collaborate by inviting them into our brainstorm meetings to really understand what are their goals. Can we align our objectives and OKRs as much as possible and share some of those, align on the shared vision, as I mentioned, and then try to figure out what types of program and roadmap items they have on their side and what are the things that they could do on the CS side that can help validate some of the hypotheses that might pave the way for the product team to prioritize engineering and product efforts to ship products in the future. So that's another way we structure that feedback loop. But ultimately, I think doing whatever you can to establish trust and a deep relationship with the key stakeholders in the CS org is really key, so that whenever there are initiatives that have dependencies with them, those can be unblocked and you could get resourcing and support from them, I think will ultimately be the most important.
Thank you.
I am going to skip to Robin's question first, because I think that's a good segue, and then I'll go back to Sandy. So do you feel that as a PLG leader, you can influence the full company orientation when at the same time, large deals are still very important in the pipeline?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely something that we have been thinking a lot about at Amplitude, given we have both a sales motion that we have invested heavily into over the last couple of years, focus on the enterprise, while at the same time, we've always had a PLG motion as well. Ever since Amplitude was a super small seed stage company, we had been doing self-serve. So we have been trying very hard to think about how do we balance these two motions, which sometimes might manifest itself as like, do we prioritize the company's resources and investments into the sales side versus the PLG side? So I definitely feel like you could influence the company's orientation, even as the company is very focused on enterprise deals and large contracts. But I think it requires a mindset shift and alignment on the leadership level on why do you need PLG as a company? What is the strategic objective that the company wants to get out of it? And also have a long-term point of view on how the company grows. So the way I view it is when a company is super focused on the hitting like revenue pipeline targets for the next quarter, it's very easy to think that all of our resources and energy should be put into landing the top dollar deals versus investing in longer term growth initiatives that would grow distribution, grow the number of free customers that would only translate into revenue maybe months or years down the line. So in order to make that mindset shift and change happen, number one prerequisite is there needs to be buy-in with leadership that long-term growth is important, that distribution in the market is a great way for the company to win in the long term. Because without that alignment, it's really hard to win the argument of why the company should still invest in growth and distribution, even though they do not translate into any dollars in the current quarter. And the way to, I think, approach that, of course, is by structuring a really compelling argument of looking at maybe successful PLG companies that are in a similar category that have successfully led a product-led growth motion. We often look to products in our adjacent categories and really study their playbooks and go to market. And we're able to showcase that there is a pretty clear path to win and really balance both motions and not just focus on one and completely neglect the other. So that's one way I think internally I found helpful to shaping that direction and really making the mindset shift happen. But at some point, you just need to have the CEO's buy-in that, hey, like this is really strategically important for the company and this is something that we have to invest in.
My next question was going to be, how do you get CEO buy-in? I hear so many growth leaders and folks who are like, I know it's important. These other people on my team know it's important, but it's hard sometimes for a CEO, or I'm saying really just like executive team, to say get distracted almost by these big deals that take long sales cycles. How do you even go about that? Like, what was the process at Amplitude? Because you all went from SMB to enterprise to a mix of product-led and enterprise?
Yeah, so just to, I guess, clarify, we started with PLG when we were like a super tiny company, and then started hiring sales reps and investing in enterprise also pretty early on. It was right after seed, I would say. And then for the last couple of years, we've been running both motions. So not just enterprise, but we have always been doing PLG, and it has definitely been a key focus for us to make sure we balance both and do both really well. So has always recognition that distribution and PLG is important. But I think what worked for us, besides really researching the best-in-class go-to-market motions out there with other players that we respect as a company, even though they may not be in the product analytics category. I think that was helpful to make sure that we are well informed on what a great balance could look like and how those companies achieve those over time. The second thing is sometimes as a growth leader, you're really good at articulating business case through quantitative data. And the way we approached it was also like through growth modeling, trying to prove that if through our set of growth initiatives and roadmap items, we are able to grow the free customer base over the next couple of years, given a set of hypotheses, this is the amount of revenue we could generate 2 years, 5 years down the line. So I think just quantifying the potential business impact, even though those are more delayed future revenue, could be super helpful. The third tactic that worked well for us was running some small experiments to really prove out that it could yield a lot of benefits. For example, when I first joined, I was part of really scaling our self-serve scholarship program for SMBs. So we have a 1-year essentially trial of our paid growth plan for eligible startups that are super early in their journey. And it was very much an experiment when we first started. We didn't know if it was going to yield a lot of revenue or business impact at all. So we ran it for a year or two, and then over time, like built more VC incubator partnerships and really grew the user base there. And then 1 and 2 years in, after these first cohort of customers were able to graduate, we saw very promising free-to-pay conversion. So that was like a proof point of an experiment proving out the hypotheses that, for example, like if we target customers super early in their journey, they will eventually turn into monetization. Even though that's such an intuitive concept that is almost like no-brainer, but just doing it and proving it with numbers actually helps also change mindset and gain confidence in the organization that it works as well.
Thank you. That was one of the best explanations I've heard of that. And it sounds like, to wrap it up, you have to be data driven. You have to go to your executive team and say, look, we ran these experiments. This is what works. This is the impact that it's going to have on the organization, and really come with proof points. Because if you can run experiments and get proof points, it's hard to kind of fight against those proof points. Sandy asked, what's the experimentation process look like? How do you decide which levers to pull, like when to pull product-led versus sales?
The experimentation process, at least how it works on the growth product team, is we first figure out what are our goals for a given quarter. Those could be pretty stable in terms of what metrics we measure, but each quarter we set like varying levels of goals depending on the business goals as well. And after understanding the business goals, we would start to brainstorm across all the product-led, marketing-led, and sales-led stakeholders and team members. What are the highest impact, highest confidence, and also the riskiest things that we can think of that will move the needle? So we really don't brainstorm around product-led initiatives. We brainstorm around all the levers that we have to pull, and then prioritize among those to figure out what are the highest impact things and also highest ROI initiatives that we would want to execute on in a given quarter. And similarly with other growth teams, we use like a RISE framework to think about reach, impact, etc. So after shortlisting a list of bets, and in that process, you might like deprioritize and reprioritize based on, do we have enough design and PM resourcing to prioritize so many in-product experiments? If not, okay, let's maybe prioritize more resourcing and try to do more marketing and sales-led experiments. Or if the product team is heavily focused on this and we don't have energy to focus on that part of the funnel, can we get some help from the growth marketing team to ship experiments that don't require product engineering resource for now, validate that hypothesis, and then invest more on the engineering side a quarter from now. So we also think about prioritization from like a resourcing and timing perspective. And then within those initiatives, we would then think about, okay, how do we roll this out? Is this an A/B test? Is this something that we ship and then just learn the impact afterwards? And then with each experiment, we usually have an owner for that experiment to really think through the hypotheses, impact sizing, and the end-to-end execution and results. What's interesting about how it works on our team is we have a very bottoms-up engineering-driven experimentation culture. So typically you might think, oh, the PM is the one who thinks through everything. But on our team, especially, all the engineers are really product-minded. So there could be like a IC engineer who is accountable to even writing an experiment design doc and then building a monitoring dashboard after something is shipped to really analyze and report back on the learnings. Because I think on growth teams, especially, ideas come from everywhere. And we wanted to encourage every single member, whether you're a designer or a marketer or an engineer, to have a stake in the roadmap and the outcomes of the team. So after every experiment launches, we definitely take a lot of time to review the data, decide if we want to follow up with any user research on the qualitative side to dig into anything that we can't really fully understand from the quantitative data as well.
That's awesome. Something I want to just squeeze in some questions that are really top of mind for me. A lot of companies, especially earlier on, it's really hard to do both PLG and enterprise sales at the same time. I think Amplitude, you got to a point later on where you had enough resources to do both. What advice would you have to other sales-led companies in B2B who are trying to think about PLG strategy for their product? And maybe this advice could be anything around timing, around stakeholders, around just like things you learned that you would do differently next time. All of that would be super helpful.
So depending on the stage of the company, I definitely agree when a company is super early stage, like let's say seed and Series A, it's really, really hard to do both and invest in both at the same time. And also, it's not like usually a good strategy to diversify so much early on in your company's journey. What I've observed as an angel investor working with a lot of enterprise software companies is that the go-to-market motion you have in the early days typically depends on the nature of your product. For example, like a DevTools company, you would just naturally know, like, okay, you need to go with a PLG approach because you see it as the type of product that an individual engineer can sign up and get value very quickly. And it's very easy to picture that bottoms up adoption motion happening. Whereas there are certain types of product where you know that an IC on a team, first of all, it might be difficult for them to maybe self-implement because of various reasons like security, legal reviews that's required, especially with data products. Or you might observe that it is the type of product that just requires a more senior person in an organization to be able to sign up and purchase. So I think founders usually have a good sense of intuition in the early stages of what motion is probably going to be the more important one to focus on in the beginning. But fast forward to several rounds afterwards, when you get more bandwidth and resources to really think about how to do both really well, some advice I would give to companies is, number one, definitely make sure you have executive leadership, sponsorship, and buy-in. There needs to be at least one person on the executive leadership team who really sponsors PLG. Or let's say if you're like a PLG company and wants to do enterprise, there just needs to be a really strong voice in the organization who really believes in that. If no one on executive team is really passionate about doing it, then I think it does not bode well to the company being able to do investing in both and doing both really well. And then second, as I mentioned before, I think being really clear on the strategic goals behind PLG and what the company is trying to accomplish with it is really important. There are two scenarios that could yield radically different results, and it has implications on what a PLG team might come up with when it comes to their initiatives. For example, if your company's strategic goal is to gain distribution, you just want to penetrate the market, gain market share, and you don't care about revenue, then when you think about pricing and packaging, you would approach it in a totally different way than if the company is really optimized for revenue. So I think being really clear and aligning with leadership on what do we want to get out of PLG is really important. Otherwise, as a growth leader in an organization, you wouldn't be able to figure out the right set of initiatives to achieve those outcomes. So aligning on the success criteria really matters. Number three is, I think, there's always going to be short-term disruption to the business. It's inevitable, whether you're a public company or an earlier stage company. For example, when you introduce PLG, when you're a sales-led company, inevitably, you're going to see some churn from maybe the paying customers in the lower segments. And there will be people in the company who are really worried about that. So I think just accepting that reality that you are going to see some disruption to the business, but being really clear on what is acceptable, I think is an exercise that companies need to go through with their leadership team to really articulate what is the upside that we expect from this over what time frame, and what is the short-term negative impact you might expect from these initiatives, and making sure everyone is fully aware going into it. I think it's important. Number four, as I mentioned before, there are ways to pilot these changes at a small scale before you just roll it out to everybody and potentially risk more on the business side. The more you can do that, I think usually the better it is to kind of ease the company into some of the bigger changes you want to push through and really learn the impact before it's too late. And then finally, some companies usually think of PLG as, oh, we just need a self-serve plan. We just need to rethink our pricing and packaging, or like make our product really easy to use. But I think it's really important not to think of these go-to-market motion changes as just a pure product change or pricing and packaging change. You also need a lot of go-to-market motion changes as the company adopts PLG. For example, how do you restructure your sales organization? What's the process for following up with PQLs, and how to train and enable the entire sales team on that? And also how to think about sales compensation. So there are a lot of things that happen outside of product, pricing, and packaging that also need to be thought through in order to do these really well.
That was awesome. And again, some things that stood out to me were the stakeholder piece, and then also aligning on kind of incentives and goals for the company. I think calling out, like, is your near-term goal revenue growth or user growth? Because that's really important to drive different strategies. And what I've seen is it really can vary across the evolution of a company, right? Like at one point you can be revenue growth, at one point user growth, but you need to be very intentional about which, especially when you're smaller. And then when you're later stage, you can kind of do a little bit of both and set clear goals for each. So let's rapid fire. Maybe Alex's question on when's a good time to start introducing PLG? Are there any situations where it's too early?
It's never too early to think about PLG. A company could be thinking about PLG since day zero when you first start out. If it's the type of product that is just suited to that motion. As I mentioned, like DevTools is a great example. And there are a lot of consumer SaaS products that are super easy for a single player to get value. And then maybe like there is some viral mechanisms built into that type of product through invites and like collaboration. First is think about what type of product you're building, and then whether you can intuitively see a bottoms up PLG motion. That is one way I would think about it. And then the second way is as the company scales, let's say you're doing enterprise or more sales-led motion right now, and you're trying to figure out, okay, when is the right time for us to introduce PLG on top of it? Several ways to assess readiness, I think, is first of all, assuming enterprise sales is your dominant motion, that it just makes a lot more sense for the company and for the type of product historically. Have you gotten to a good place with that motion? Do you feel like it's running smoothly and that the company has bandwidth and resource to invest in a different motion? Because if not, then I think what might happen is the company tries to do both, but the team who's tasked with doing PLG doesn't have the right mind share from leadership, resources to do it really well. And their initiatives might result in failure just because of that versus PLG just not working for that company. So I think it does make sense to think about layering on a totally different motion when you have established some level of process and comfort with the one that you have historically been focusing on versus just trying to experimentally put one or two people on something else, because I think it's a really big initiative that requires a lot of mind share and efforts from the team.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was awesome. I thought this was a very interesting kind of AMA and a little bit different than our normal with the product and growth mindset and really diving deeper into experiments. And I think the most interesting part for me is kind of how a lot of decisions that are made kind of at the top, you can see how it impacts growth and then how that also impacts sales and customer success and other teams. So I learned a ton. I thought that was incredible. I really, really appreciate your expertise from both leading PLG at Amplitude, but also advising a bunch of startups and kind of comparing, the difference between early on, what you're able to prioritize versus later on in Amplitude's journey when they can prioritize a lot more. So we had a couple more questions. Where can they reach you or get in touch if they have more questions for you?
I use LinkedIn a lot, so feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. It's just Andrea Wang. I also have my personal email posted there as well, so feel free to send me an email afterwards if you want to chat more.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This was incredible. I so appreciate your time and I love learning from you.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much to the community. We'll see you next time.